this incredibly awesome music to bring you some incredibly awesome political talk on Damn Radio.
Well, this is Samuel Trapp here on Damn Radio. Very glad to have you, and I want to get started with a couple of things, but first I'll tell you that I'm here live in the Lake Ozark Real Estate of the Art Studio. Feel free to call in 573-746-8020 or send emails to live@damnradio.com or to me, Samuel T. at International Flavor. So I have a look at them. I read you. I haven't been here since Thursday, so this is my first show of the week. Thursday's the last, and I spoke some on Thursday about Moldova and what is happening there. Okay, so and you don't hear about it here because nobody will point out the obvious, that once again the EU and Western deep staters are creating impossible conditions for any party to kick out the ruling party that is very pro-Europe. And, I told you about the examples they created. So they have the same number, and they have rules that allow people that are living in other countries to still vote. And so in the U.S., there are a number of polling stations for Moldovans. In all over Europe, they have polling stations for Moldovans, and they want them from there. But they didn't want them in two particular areas, and, probably more than that, actually. But Russia has about 300,000 Moldovans living in Russia. Same number as Italy. Italy has approximately 300,000 living in Italy, Moldovans. And there's tons of them all over Europe. They all leave, work elsewhere, right? But they're still Moldovan citizens, can still legally vote. Same goes within Russia. But Russia got 2 polling stations, 2, across all of Russia for 300,000 votes. And I just saw the numbers brought out, 4,100 votes total in those 2 polling stations. Okay? Meanwhile, 70 polling stations in Italy had close to 220,000 votes. And so the intent is to cut off people from who might be pro-Russian and not allow them to vote. So they've used all kinds of scams. Well, they've outlawed all of the opposition. I'm going to read a bunch of this to you today, and I'm hoping it doesn't take too long because I also want to get to Sergei Lavrov and all of his appearances at the UN. And you won't hear anything about this in Western media. You never do. That's why I believe I'm going to give you his entire press conference. I'm going to all the questions that were asked of him and all the responses. He gave a 20-minute commentary, I suppose you would call it, little speech in front of the entire hall. It was like 20 minutes. We might be able to get into that. I hope we do. But I want to start with what's going on in Moldova, because once again, they are seriously stealing elections. I mean, this is how it's done. You outlaw all the other parties, and who do you expect to win? That was the content of the article I read you the other day. That people were saying, geez, well, what do you expect? The opposition leaders are all in prison. The ones who were really going to take effect and have some good possibilities of showing strong numbers, they outlawed the parties. So first of all, you jail the leaders, then you outlaw the party so nobody can vote, and then you destroy or you don't put any polling places. Now, there's a place called Transnistria, and Transnistria borders Ukraine, and it's heavily Russian. And just like Odessa is inside of Ukraine is heavily Russian, just like Nikolaeva inside of Ukraine is heavily Russian. And in Transnistria, same thing occurred. There's all kinds of stuff going on about this, and it's backed by the EU won't say a word about this. They never do. So let's get a start to where we are. And they've been having updates all day, and I have been following these updates. And there were only 12 polling stations made available in Transnistria. That's it. And I mean, it's nonsense. And so they couldn't vote in Transnistria. Not permitted. You know, you couldn't get to them. And it is pretty alarming. So I'm going to cover a lot of that today, and I'll try to skip around, but let's get the general article here, because the pro-EU ruling party, which is already in charge, they're going to get a majority with overseas votes. You know, all they got to do is get over 50%, and they will be there because of what games they have played. And but you know, several hours ago they were saying, no, I might not make it. Looks like they're going to need to work with another party to get there. So the story is like this. With almost all ballots counted, Moldova's pro-EU ruling party, PAS, is ahead in the parliamentary contest, which is billed as a turning point in the nation's history. The vote has nearly concluded. Overseas ballots are still being tallied and seen as a potentially decisive for the final outcome. Out of 301 polling stations, Chisinau opened just 2 in Russia. Only about 4,100 votes were counted there, despite tens of thousands of Moldovan citizens living in the country. Long lines formed in Moscow throughout the day, and after the station closed, many people were left outside waiting to cast their ballots. The residents of the predominantly Russian-speaking breakaway region of Transnistria complained that the authorities in Chisinau blocked bridges across the Dniester River to prevent them from reaching polling stations. Officials in Chisinau and Brussels presented the election as a democratic milestone, while the opposition contends the script was pre-written. The race pits President Maya Sandu against the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, PEB, which is campaigning for Moldova's constitutional neutrality. Sandu, first elected in 2020 and narrowly re-elected in 2024, faces recurring claims of presiding over electoral irregularities. Opposition groups insist that the decisive votes last year came from Moldovans living in EU countries. And at the same time, Moldova accused Chisinau of disenfranchising citizens living in Russia, where only a handful of polling stations were opened, with hundreds across Western Europe. Just days before the vote, the Central Election Commission barred 2 opposition parties, Gradle Moldova and Heart of Moldova, accusing them of undeclared foreign funds and violating campaign rules. They join a growing list. The Victory Bloc was deregistered early in 2025, and the SOR party was dissolved by the court in June of 2023. And these were important courts. And so let's see. Here's what I was telling you about from the other day. Moldova, Brussels has called this a milestone on the European path. Yet with opposition parties banned, observers blocked, voters in key regions sidelined, the election looks not like a democratic contest at all, but more like an attempt to force a pro-EU outcome. First of all, watchdogs cannot watch. The Moldovan Central Election Commission this week denied accreditation to more than 30 international organizations and 100 observers from over 50 countries. Among those barred were Russian experts nominated to the OSCE official mission, a first in European electoral practice. Moldova Foreign Ministry claimed the decision was taken in line with national law. The Patriotic Bloc, an opposition alliance, accused authorities of deliberately creating an observer blackout. Its lawyers listed applications from reputable NGOs in Italy, Germany, France, Spain, and the U.S. that were ignored or rejected. Moscow calls this a blatant breach of OSCE commitment and summoned its Moldovan ambassador to the Kremlin. The EU, usually vocal and critical of democracy standards in the Eastern Bloc, remains conspicuously silent. Parties have been erased by decree. Elections are meant to let citizens decide, but in Moldova, key players were just removed from the ballot. On September 26, 2 days before the election, Harta Moldova Party was suspended for 12 months by court order, accused of money laundering, campaign finance, and struck all Heart of Moldova candidates from the Patriotic Bloc list. Its leader, former Gagauza governor Irina Vla, called it a political spectacle. On the same day, the CEC barred the Great Moldova Party, led by Victoria Fortuna, citing undeclared foreign funds and links to the already banned SOR party. Fortuna had already been sanctioned by the EU in July for receiving support from fugitive oligarch Ilan Sor. In June 23, the SOR party itself, which was led by the exiled businessman Ilan Shor, was dissolved by the Constitutional Court as well, accused of corruption and threatening Moldova's sovereignty. Pro-EU Moldovan President Maia Sandu celebrated this ban as a victory against a party created out of corruption and for corruption. They say the same thing about her, by the way. Opposition leaders called it the end of pluralism. These bans come on top of sweeping new laws rushed through Parliament this summer, which allows the government to strike any successor party of a banned group. So your group gets banned, you don't even get to create a new party and start over. Of banned groups, they are kept from the ballot for 5 years, so you can't do anything about it. The Venice Commission and OSCE warned such blanket exclusions could violate basic political rights. So all the rivals are under investigation, in exile, or behind bars. So even when parties survive, their leaders are sidelined. Igor Dogin, Moldovan president from 2016 to 2022, is under criminal investigation for treason, illicit enrichment, and the notorious Kuliak bribery case. He claims the charges are fabricated. Marina Tauber, vice chair of the outlawed SOR party, is being tried in absentia when she ran away to Moscow. Evgenia Gutsul, elected governor of autonomous Gagauzia in 2023, was sentenced in August to 7 years in prison for funneling Russian funds to the SOR party. Her supporters protested outside the courthouse and declared she declared the verdict a sentence not on me but on Moldovan democracy. And everybody agrees that her jailing is politically motivated. So, I mean, we talk about this in the United States. I suppose we got to consider ourselves lucky because, you look at this Eastern Europe joke that goes on. And all of them are doing it. They're doing it even in the ones that they're doing it in Germany, for God's sake. They are taking out voting opportunities for all these people. Why? Because the deep state, which has a globalist tendency, they're all in on this, and they have to somehow figure out how to pull this off. And the 4% of the U.S. and 4% of the world, which includes the U.S. and the EU, we're supposed to rule the entire world through all this deep state stuff. And so what do? You destroy other political parties. You don't let them talk at all. You don't let them participate. You can't have a candidate. Nothing. So the voters are also pushed aside. For Moldovan citizens in the breakaway region of Transnistria, the chance to vote was slashed. In 2021, there were 40 polling stations in east of the Dniester. This year, 12 were approved, all on government-controlled land, kilometers from demarcation lines. Days before the election, the CEC located 4 of those sites even further inland, citing security threats. The Interior Ministry warned of possible bomb scares and provocations in the security zone. Critics call it voter suppression. Russian Ambassador Oleg Ozerov described the changes as unprecedented, saying they were announced less than 48 hours before Election Day. Nonsense. Transnistrian authorities accuse Chisinau, that's the capital, of deliberately reducing turnout in a region that leans heavily toward the opposition parties. By contrast, more than 300 polling stations were opened abroad, including 73 in Italy, where the Moldovan diaspora numbers some 100,000, and only 2 in Russia, where the size is similar. Sorry, I think I said 300,000 earlier. A disparity that hints at the government's priorities. Democracy by emergency decree. This is not the first time Sandu's government pushed democratic boundaries. Since 2022, PAS ruled under rolling state emergency, citing Ukraine's conflict with Russia. Using her emergency powers, she shut down 6 television stations accused of spreading Russian propaganda, blocked Russian journalists from entering the country, and passed 13 laws tightening control over parties and candidates. Reporters Without Borders and OSCE flagged concerns on media freedom and selective application of the law. Brussels is applauding. Brussels consistently praises the Sandu government, saying this Moldova is a success story for advancing its bid for EU membership. Just this week, EU officials accused Moscow of interfering in the elections through disinformation. There's that word again. But inside Moldova, the picture is different. Courts have been turned into campaign tools, whole parties erased, governors jailed, observers turned away. Parliamentary Assembly in the Council of Europe has called for an inclusive and fair process, diplomatic language for don't tilt the table. The Venice Commission cautioned against blanket bans that undermine the right to be elected. The vote is supposed to be about Moldova's future, yet so much of the present has been quietly erased. The rivals that might have challenged PAS are gone, behind bars, or in exile. The voters in Transnistria, who might have shifted the balance, have fewer polling stations than ever before. Even observers whose job is to watch have been turned away. Isn't that curious? Curious. Now I wanted to go through some of the updates on this, because you ought to see some of these videos that are there, people being locked out. The guy from Telegram, what is his name? I forget. He was asked to, there was a story about him that he was asked to block, to ban Moldovan channels ahead of the election. And he refused. And so that's another part of the news. So let's see. The percentages are very close now. It looks like they haven't put a new, I have these live updates scrolling across my screen, and they haven't really put them. I'm going to go back to, for them, they're like 8 hours ahead of us. And so when you see these numbers that started, all of these were post-election. So the election polls had already closed, and so you saw the numbers going up. And about 8 p.m., they had 50% of the 8 p.m. their time, or Greenwich Mean Time, which would have been about 10 p.m., 11 p.m. their time. After processing 50% of the ballots, Moldova's ruling party received 42% of the vote, and BEP received 29% of the vote. And then with those percentages just kept going up. There was a flash protest put up by the BEP people outside of the Central Election Commission, and that was all over X. 82% of the ballots in the ruling party had 44%. And it just kept on going that way. I think the test for how this is, with 85% of the ballots counted, 45%. This was a few hours later. It just kept on growing, and they showed the totals of different where these votes came from. Final results. This is here about 9:45 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which add a few hours for Moldova. But final results from the breakaway public, predominantly Russian-speaking of Transnistria, were finalized, and showed the Patriotic Bloc won 51% of the vote, followed by PAS with 29%, Alternative Bloc with 8.9%, Our Party with 2.9%, and Democracy at Home with 2.3%. And it says only 12 polling stations were made available for residents, all located on government-controlled territory. Local voters complained that authorities in Chisinau blocked bridges across the river, which I told you about before. And in Moscow, there's a huge line. You should see this. They were shouting, "Open the polling stations" on Saturday night because they didn't get to vote, and there wasn't enough. I mean, there were thousands of them in line, and so they shut it down. And you won't see any of this. You'll see tomorrow. Tomorrow they'll go, "Oh, the ruling party won. The pro-European party won." Well, Jesus, there's nobody you can't go against them, and Europe's all for it. You won't hear a word about this. It's nonsense. And here it was about 10:30 Greenwich Mountain Time, so about 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning maybe, with almost all ballots inside Moldova counted, except for the capital of Chisinau. With 99.6% of polling stations reporting, the ruling party is ahead with 44.2% of the bloc, followed by the Patriotic Bloc with 28.2% and Alternative Bloc with 9.2%. The bulk of the remaining ballots are expected from overseas voters. In the past, these votes have proved decisive, most notably in the contested 2024 presidential election, when ballots cast abroad helped Maya Sandu narrowly secure re-election. So I don't think she's on the ballot this time. I think that these are all just parliamentary. And so now they said citizens abroad dominated 77.2% by this PAS crowd. So it's strongly leaning toward pro-EU candidates, and that's why they want these voting stations. And so it looks like the ruling party is leading in the capital with 52% of the vote. Across the rest of the country, she received 44.2%. And controversy has surrounded Moldova's handling of expatriates, while hundreds of polling stations where hundreds of thousands of Moldovan citizens reside in Russia. Long lines outside the Moscow embassy meant that many were unable to cast ballots before the polls closed. So far, 211 of 301 foreign polling stations reported. This was about 11 p.m. with 190,000 and so passed, just kept going up. 81% of the vote. It's 49.2, so they anticipate it being all the way. 8 polling stations in Canada, 23 in the U.S. We're waiting for at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. Within the country, the ruling party PAS has 44%, and various opposition receive 49%. With votes from abroad coming in, PAS is gaining 49% of the total, and they will probably end up with an outright majority in parliament. And so that's the last that they've put out there. So I imagine we'll get up tomorrow and know that Moldova has successfully been stolen. The parliament of Moldova has successfully been stolen by the acts of the government. So you can't trust your governments in any country, ours, theirs, anywhere, unfortunately. And so that is unfortunate for the country of Moldova. Now, there's plenty more stories to go into along there, but I really wanted to get to Lavrov. There was an interesting story, kind of a. I mean, it's not really funny, but it was a Russian orchestra played on in a blackout caused by a Ukrainian attack, and so Russian border region, Belgorod, this is where it happened. 3 civilians were injured, and there was a partial power blackout. But musicians in Belgorod continued a performance they were on, according to a video shared by the governor. Ukrainian forces launched a missile attack on the border region, causing power interruptions, including downtown. In a video, which is kind of a funny video, the same evening, Belgrade State Philharmonic Orchestra is seen playing classical music in the darkness. Audience members are holding up their phones. Music is eternal, as is the heroism of our musicians, said the governor, and said that music continued to play even after the lights went out in the Philharmonic Hall. Isn't that funny? Let's see. I'm going to go to our Sergei Lavrov. So I wanted to give you a couple of opposing views tonight, but I thought it was important because over a 4 or 5 day period, there were all kinds of topics going on at the UN Security Council, everywhere. And you don't hear enough about other people's speeches. You hear all about Donald Trump, you hear all about even Marco Rubio, but nobody's really focused a whole lot on Sergei Lavrov, who is always way up there on the political spectrum as a hell of a politician. And so I wanted to share with you a press conference that he gave, but before I got to that, I wanted to also share I keep wanting to say the word in Russian. I don't know what to call it. Presentation, I guess you would have to call it. It's a выступление in Russian, and that's what I keep wanting to say it is. And so he gave about a 20-minute one, and I don't think maybe it'll take me that long to read his entire comments, but I think they're important, and I think it's necessary to listen to the words of opposing viewpoint. And so I'm going to read this, and then he went right from here into a press conference. There were several other things that he did, and I've listened to them all, and I saw them all, and these are things that are very important, and people don't hear opposing viewpoints at all. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you what he said specifically at the General Assembly of the UN. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago, the most terrible war in the history of mankind ended. More than 70 million people became victims of military action, hunger, and disease. In 1945, the course of world history changed forever. The triumph over German Nazism, under whose banners most of Europe stood, and Japanese militarism paved the way for peace, recovery, and prosperity. This year, celebrations were held in Moscow and Beijing, timed for the holiday days of May 9 and September 3rd, in honor of the victory in the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War. The world saw grandiose military parades, the recognition of the decisive contribution of the peoples of the Soviet Union to the collapse of Nazi Germany, and the special role of the Chinese people in the defeat of military Japan. We honor the memory of the combat brotherhood with the Allies, who were then on the side of truth in the fight against the forces of evil. One of the inevitable results of that war was the creation of the United Nations." He's going to say some things here. "The principles and regulations agreed by the founders of our organization to this day serve as a bright beacon of international cooperation. They embody the centuries-long experience of coexistence of states and fully preserve their importance in the era of multipolarity. It is only necessary that all, without exception, states and members comply with these principles in their fullness, in their unity and interrelationship. In practice, however, everything is different. The universal and crude violation of the principle of sovereign equality of states undermines the very faith in justice, leads to crisis and conflicts." So, last week, I can't remember if it was JR or somebody, but I know I played a little bit of Trump's. Trump trashed him too. Trump trashed the UN, and here Lavrov is trashing the UN. China trashed the UN. Everybody's trashing the UN because they just suck, but everybody's a member of it. And India trashes the UN. It's like, when are you gonna? This multipolarity thing is a big deal. They're tired of being told what to do by a small percentage of the group. So with that in mind, we're going to continue. Let's see. It is only necessary that all without blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm sorry, I thought I had read that already. Without exception, states and members comply with the principles in their fullness, in unity and interrelationship. In practice, however, everything is different. Universal, crude violation of the principle of sovereign equality undermines the very faith in justice, leads to more crisis and conflict. The root of the problem is the unceasing attempt to divide the world into democracy and autocracy, into the blooming garden and turn it into the jungle, into those who are at the table and those who are on the menu, into the chosen ones that are allowed to do everything, and into the rest who, for some reason, are obliged to serve the interests of the golden billion. There's that term again. We stand for the unbiased study of the principle of equality. It is a guarantee that all countries will be able to take their rightful place in the world order, regardless of their military power, population, size of territory, or economy. The principle of non-application of force and threat of force has been repeatedly supported by the West, but the NATO bombings in Yugoslavia turned into tragedy. The U.S.-led coalition invasion of Iraq, NATO's military operation to change regimes in Libya. Today, Israel's illegal use of force against the Palestinians, aggressive actions against Iran, Qatar, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and threats to blow up the entire Middle East. from Israel he's talking about. Russia severely condemned the attack of the Hamas militants on the peaceful Israelis on October 7, 2023. However, there is no justification for the cruel killing of Palestinian civilian population as well as for terrorist attacks. There is no justification for collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza, where Palestinian children are dying from starvation, hospitals and schools are being destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people are losing their lives. There is no justification for the plans to annex the western coast of the Jordan River. In fact, we are dealing with an attempt of a kind of coup d'etat with the aim of burying the UN resolution on the creation of a Palestinian state. The other day, a number of Western governments announced recognition of the Palestinian state, and they announced their intention to do this a few months ago. The question arises, why did they wait? Apparently, they hoped that soon, by the time of Sozov's session of the General Assembly, there would be nothing and no one to recognize. The situation requires urgent attention to prevent such a scenario, which is why the participants of the high-level International Conference on Palestine issue spoke up. They deserve to be commended for the strikes on Iranian facilities under the guarantee of the Magat, and then for the strikes on the Qatar capital at the time of the negotiations with Hamas, for the participation of American intermediaries. They do need to be condemned for all of this. I agree with him. Yesterday, at the Security Council, the West rejected China and Russia's nuclear proposal to give time for diplomacy. This ultimately exposed the course of the West to sabotage the search for constructive solutions at the Security Council, and the West's desire to achieve unilateral concessions from Tehran by blackmail and pressure. We consider this policy unacceptable, and all the manipulations to restore the UN's anti-Iranian sanctions, as well as the sanctions themselves, are illegal. The West is not used to observing the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. The sad phenomenon of our time is color revolutions, and illegal one-sided sanctions have long since become the main tool of Western diplomacy. And no matter what proposals justify them, the essence of sanctions is one: to suppress and intimidate competitors in the world economy and politics. Russia, along with the vast majority of UN members, stand for the immediate cancellation of the unprecedented conditions of the Cuba trade blockade, which has been going on for more than 60 years, and for its exclusion from the notorious list of terrorism-sponsored countries. We express solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the conditions of their external sanctions pressure and direct threats. We stand for the preservation of Latin America and the Caribbean basin as a zone of peace and cooperation. A drunken example of the undermining of sovereignty and gross interference in international affairs is the actions of the West in the Balkans, where such a constitutional principle as the need for UN members to implement the decisions of the Security Council is based. The one-sided recognition of Kosovo's independence in the context of 1244 resolution has essentially become an attempt at the state system of Serbia. I told you about that last week. And then told you about the same thing in Bosnia. Oh, he goes there too. Now the West has taken a course for the collapse of the statehood of Bosnia and Herzegovina, sabotaging the Dayton Peace Agreement. And in Kosovo and Bosnia, an attack has been launched on vital interests of the Serbian people, including the original rights of Serbian Orthodoxy. In the same way, the Kiev regime which seized power as a result of the anti-communist coup organized by the West in 2014, has taken a course for the liquidation of both the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and for the legal extermination of the Russian language in all spheres of education, culture, and media. Ukraine is the only country in the world that has legally prohibited the use of its native language by almost half of the population. The Arabic language is not prohibited in Israel, and Hebrew in Arab countries in Iran, and Russian in Ukraine is prohibited. Let me remind you that Article 1 of the Constitution talks about the need for respect of human rights and basic freedoms for all, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. Europe is silent about this, but is obsessed with the utopian goal of bringing Russia a strategic defeat. For this reason, the Ukrainian regime is allowed everything, including terrorist attacks against politicians and journalists, torture and external executions, non-electoral bombing of civilian facilities, reckless sabotage of nuclear power plants. Russia, as President Putin has repeatedly emphasized, has been and remains open to negotiation to eliminate the primary causes of this conflict. But the security of Russia and its vital interests must be reliably guaranteed. The rights of Russian and Russian-speaking people in the territories that remain under the control of the Kiev regime must be fully restored. On this basis, I am ready to speak about the guarantees of Ukraine's security. So far, neither Kiev nor its European sponsors are aware of the sharpness of the moment and are ready to negotiate honestly. The North Atlantic Alliance continues to expand close to our borders, contrary to the Soviet leaders' assurances not to move an inch to the east. Contrary to NATO and OSCE obligations, we must abide by the principle of indivisibility and security, not to strengthen our own security at the expense of others, and not to claim domination. We have repeatedly proposed to NATO capitals to respect their obligations and agree on legally binding guarantees of security. Our proposals in 2008 and subsequent ones, including December 2021, have been ignored and are still being ignored. Moreover, the threat of force against Russia, which is accused of almost planning to attack NATO and the European Union, is becoming more and more frequent. President Putin has repeatedly instigated such commentary, or I think they meant the opposite there. I don't think that's a good translation. I don't remember him saying that. Russia did not and does not have any such intention. However, any aggression against my country will be resolutely repelled. There should be no doubt about this. Those in NATO and the European Union who not only convince their voters of the inevitability of war with Russia and force them to tighten their belts and openly declare that they are preparing to attack our Kaliningrad region and other Russian territories. We have high hopes for the continuation of Russian-American dialogue, especially after the summit in Alaska. In the approaches of the current U.S. administration, we see an aspiration not only to facilitate, where do we go? I lost my place. The search for realistic ways to regulate the Ukrainian crisis, but also a desire to develop pragmatic interaction without getting into an ideological position. Russia has a special responsibility for the situation in the world, for avoiding the risks that can lead humanity to a new war. New initiatives of the Russian Federation proposed by President Putin on September 22 are intended to support strategic stability. We are ready to adhere to the central quantitative restriction on the Treaty on Strategic Offensive Weapons within 1 year after the expiration of its effect on February 5, 2026, on the condition that the United States act in a similar way and will not take steps that violate the existing restraints. We believe the implementation of our proposal will allow us to create conditions necessary to avoid the race of strategic weapons, to maintain an acceptable level of predictability in missile and nuclear sphere, and to improve the overall atmosphere in Russian-American relations. Colleagues, in December of this year, we marked the 65th anniversary of the General Assembly's adoption of the Declaration on the Provision of Independence for Colonial Countries and Nations. The process of decolonization, which played a role in which the Soviet Union played a role, became a direct consequence of the implementation of rights of nations to self-determination. The peoples of Africa and Asia refused to live under the oppression of colonizers. In the same way, after the 2014 coup in Ukraine, Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya refused to submit to the Kiev neo-Nazi regime, which illegally seized power, which not only does not represent the interests of the population, but also launched a war against them. In both cases, the principle established in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence, which was later confirmed by many American presidents, was implemented. The principle is that governments get their legitimacy from the consent of those ruled. Both the colonizers and the Kiev regime had no consent of the people they are trying to govern. This principle, by the way, is unanimously confirmed in the UN Declaration of 1970, in which it was clearly stated that everyone should respect territorial integrity of those countries whose governments represent all people living on the corresponding territory. Today, Africa and the entire global South are experiencing a new awakening, striving for complete independence, and the UN should not be left out. In December of last year, the General Assembly approved the resolution on eradication of colonialism in all its forms and manifestations. We urge you, as the next step, to make a decision on the announcement of the International Day of Struggle Against Colonialism on December 14th. We welcome the role of the group of friends in defending the UN Charter in consolidating efforts to counter neo-colonial and other discriminatory practices against the world majority, and we invite all independent states to join this initiative and this group. The existing balance of power in the world is radically different from the one that was established 80 years ago. The process of decolonization and other large-scale upheaval have changed the political map of the planet. The world majority is loud about their rights. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and others play a special role as a mechanism for the coordination of the countries of the global South and East. The influence of the African Union, CELAC, and other regional unions is strengthening. These new realities have not yet found a proper reflection in the system of institutions of our organization. The reform of the Security Council is especially important. Russia supports its democratization exclusively through the expansion of the representation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We support the claims of Brazil and India to a permanent registration in the Council, while at the same time correcting the historical injustices against Africa in the parameters that are agreed upon by the countries of the continent. Recently, General Secretary Guterres proposed a comprehensive UN reform. This really does need to happen, by the way. We are not against an open discussion of this initiative. The focus should be on the return of the UN to the principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter and which the West has long sought to replace with its rules-based order. It is important that the work should be transparent with the participation and consideration of the interests of all member states. We call on the General Assembly and all Secretariat employees to strictly follow the principles of impartiality and equality in accordance with Article 100 of the Charter. We cannot allow the Secretariat to attempt a palace coup. It's privatization by a small group of countries. He's talking about the U.S. and Europe. The Secretariat should reflect the new realities and provide a fair representation of the countries of the world's majority. Like I said, there's only 4%. You add up all the population of the U.S. and Europe, it's 4% of the world's population, according to Jeffrey Sachs in the article he did last week. And but we hold a huge advantage in anything related to the UN, anything related to International Monetary Fund, World Bank, all of those. And people are sick of it. And now, Russia's talking about it. China's talking about it. India's talking about it. They're all tired of this. So they're creating their own concurrent organizations. And I believe the UN either has to reform or something different has to happen. It'll probably end up failing. We expect a constructive discussion on the development of the organization at a special meeting of the Security Council, which Russia plans to organize as the chair on the day of the UN, October 24th. The UN reform is only part of the comprehensive task of transforming the entire global governance system, including the true democratization of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, as well as the role of the global South and East in the world economy, finance, and trade. In discussion on global reform, we must not ignore the fact that today the situation in the sphere of international security is deteriorating. I've already spoken about the reasons, and I will repeat the main one: the desire to maintain hegemony with the support of foreign military forces. More and more countries and regions are involved in this confrontation scheme. NATO is already close to Europe, and it penetrates the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait, undermining the universal mechanisms of ASEAN and posing a threat not only to China and Russia, but to other countries in the region. This new stage of NATO expansion is justified by the inseparable security of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. Under this slogan, Russia is trying to take over Eurasia. According to them, it means Russia is trying to take over the entire Eurasia. Russia and its allies are proposing a constructive alternative to this dangerous course: to build in Eurasia an architecture of equal and inseparable security, not for NATO members and their allies, but for all, without exception, countries and unions of the continent, including the SHOS, the CIS, ASEAN, Eurasis, and CSTO, the Soviet Union, the Arab Gulf states, and others. For this purpose, Belarus and Russia, as partners in an allied state, are proposing to develop the Eurasian map of diversity and multipolarity in the 21st century. The genuine multilateral process is inevitable after the West has made the Euro-Atlantic model of securing security with NATO, the EU, and the OSCE completely meaningless. We do not see any prospect for the idea of restoring this model in Europe in its original form, which some European capitals have suddenly begun to think about. Speaking of the future, we must not forget the lessons of the past, especially in a situation where Nazism is rising in Europe again and militarization is gaining momentum under the same anti-Russian slogan. This raises the greater concern that a number of political figures who are in power in Brussels and in capitals in the EU and NATO countries are seriously discussing the Third World War as a likely scenario. These figures are making every effort to find a balance of interests of all members of the international community, trying to impose their one-sided approaches on others, and to put it bluntly, they are breaking the key constitutional requirements, which I have already mentioned more than once. Respect for sovereign equality of states. This equality is the foundation of the objectively formed multilaterality. Wow. Is that really a word? Formed multilateralism, I would say, but Russia is not agitating for a revolution against anyone. Our country has endured more revolutions than others. We simply urge the member states and the leadership of the Secretariat to follow the principle of the Constitution without exception, without double standards. Then the legacy of the founding fathers of the EU will not have been wasted. Thank you for your attention. So that was Sergei Lavrov, translated in for English for you into what he said. And I believe he came up with some, there was very strong anti-hegemony, very strong rebuild the UN, rebuild the Security Council, actually pay attention to the initial process, the initial potential, that they talked about when the place was founded, when the UN was founded. And there's no doubt Trump doesn't think it's doing anything correct. He criticized him, his entire speech that he gave. I think I shared most of that with you through this past week. And I know that JR shared some of it on his program, and a very good way. And but anyway, I think it's important to put some of these things out. I wanted to also go through, because he had a full press conference afterward, and he said, and this was like a minute afterward, and he said, good afternoon. Before we start, I'd like to note that we have published materials on the hateful rhetoric of the Kiev regime, fake news, and other such facts in Ukraine. Please take a look at these materials. That was Maria Zakharova saying that. And then she goes, and now a word from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov. He says, I'm glad to see everyone, including old and good acquaintances. As a tradition, we finish the week of high-level meetings with you and try to answer your questions as transparently and openly as possible. I will not make any long, substantive introductory remarks. I hope you journalists have kept an eye on what is happening. Our speech has just been heard in the hall of the General Assembly. The main directions of Russian foreign policy were outlined there. My main conclusion at this stage of the General Assembly is that the world is undergoing a deep transformation. As part of this transformation, there are two major processes. One is an objective, historically justified process of the formation of a multipolar world, firmly based on the principle of sovereign state equality laid down in the UN Charter. The second group of countries are those who still want to preserve a unipolar world, to preserve what we used to call the golden billion, to preserve neo-colonial and and colonial methods whose essence are the same, to live at the expense of others. There are many examples of this. I have no doubt that you, as journalists, are interested in what is happening. You are interested in how countries are trying to explain their positions and how these words are diverging or not diverging with the current affairs. Therefore, I propose to immediately move on to questions and answers, and Mario will direct this process. And she says, first question from Association of UN Correspondents. And his name is Mr. Formy. Thank you, Minister of Foreign Affairs, for the press conference on behalf of the Association of UN Correspondents. I am Valeria Rybaka. The EU says that it is already in a state of hybrid war with Russia. According to NATO, the violation of airspace by Russia is a violation of the law. What is your response to these accusations? He says, let me give you an example. When the drones fell on Polish territory on the same day, as soon as the Poles began to raise the alarm, we proposed to hold a meeting on the line of the Ministry of Defense and to deal with the situation in a professional way, without hysterics, to look at the wreckage, to talk about what kind of drones they are, what's the radius of their action, etc. Those drones that were allegedly found on Polish territory, if these are the ones we are talking about, their flight range is less than that of the Russian Federation to the Polish border, which means they can't have reached there. But I repeat, when they leave an honest conversation, they accuse you of everything. But when you propose to sit down and sort it out, they say no. We do not want to sort it out. You know everything. It's good that you start with this issue, because a year ago, in the same hall, at the same table, I told you how we are trying to achieve the truth regarding a provocation that was arranged in April 2022 in Bucha, when, after Russian units left the suburbs of Kiev, including the suburbs of Kiev called Bucha, and we left there because we were called by the Western countries to create an atmosphere of trust for peace agreements that were planning to be signed. This is when they had an agreement signed in Istanbul, and then Boris Johnson, convinced him not to. And so Bucha was right after that, April 2022. They had already decided this, which was later broken by Boris Johnson. So when our units left the village of Bucha, 2 days later, and coincidentally, BBC reporters showed corpses to everyone all over the world, laying carefully along the main street of the city of Bucha. So in 2 days, so that nobody would notice them, and then, well, that was not properly translated. So in 2 days, nobody noticed them, and then all of a sudden, on the third day, they were exposed. But this just doesn't happen. So I told you how I've been addressing all of these for almost 3 years. I've been addressing the Secretary General. Moreover, we even sent an official request to the UN Human Rights Commission and asked for one thing. The investigation that we called for, no one wanted to organize, and we asked to publish at least the names of those whose bodies were shown on BBC. The Secretary General, I talked to him about this again yesterday. He shrugged his shoulders and said that he could not do this. Then he said he asked, and he was refused. But we also addressed, as I said, the management of the UN Human Rights Commission officially in writing a year ago. We received the answer only this summer. And the answer, of course, says amazing things, that the possibility of disclosing the data on the victims is being considered jointly with the Department of Human Rights of the Secretariat. Then we were told that the lawyers of the Secretariat issued a verdict on the inaccuracy of the disclosure of the data on the victims in Bucha in order to ensure the safety of their relatives. A year ago, when everything was in a deadlock, I called for you I called for your journalistic excitement. Like, how come journalists aren't digging into this? Well, they never will. Are you not interested in finding out what kind of people, whose bodies were shown there, what were their names, who they were? None of you, as I understand it, has arranged a journalistic investigation, although there are many such investigations about much less serious incidents. Therefore, going back to the first question, we have nothing to hide. We do not attack civilian objects. Incidents happen, but we never shoot at civilians. We never send our drones or missiles to the states that are located in Europe, to the members of the European Union, to the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance. And once again, if the Poles really wanted to figure this out, we offered a meeting. We offered a meeting immediately, but no one ever wants to discuss the facts. For example, when we were accused, and then it turned out that it was the Ukrainians who hit the market and the maternity home and many other examples. We know them well. That's true. It happened twice. It's just that when the first accusations are made, then the journalists, including those who raise this noise, do not want to deal with these issues. Maybe they just are not allowed. But we are always open to honest conversation. Pretty good answer, huh? Good afternoon, Mr. President. That is what they said, but maybe it's because he's the president of the UN thing for this year. Yesterday, following the result of the vote, the UN Security Council rejected the project proposed by Russia and China to extend UN Resolution 2231 on Iranian nuclear program. What are the consequences of renewal of UN sanctions against Iran? Do you think it's still possible to solve the issue of Iranian nuclear programs through diplomacy? If so, what steps is Russia prepared to take? He responded on this for a while, but I'm going to skip that one. I don't want to focus on Iran today. But they were talking about Russia also proposed, they've signed a recent deal with a $25 billion deal to create 3 or 4, I can't remember the exact number, nuclear power plants in Iran. And that's already been signed, and it's going to happen. But they also wanted to lift some sanctions. So if you're interested in that, you can go and listen to Mr. Lavrov in this question again, but I'm going to move on to a different one. Mr. Minister, welcome to New York. A couple of days ago, after the meeting with President Zelensky, President Trump said that he believes that Ukraine can take back all the territories they have lost. And then you met with Mr. Marco Rubio, and you had constructive negotiations, as we have heard, taking into account the constantly changing policy of American colleagues. How does Russia plan to work with the United States, especially with Trump's administration on this issue? He says, you can call it ever-changing, you can call it flexible policies. You see, each state and each leader has his own style of doing business in the international arena, just like at home. And we appreciate that the United States understands, most importantly, that in principle it is wrong when states refuse to even talk to each other, as the Europeans and Biden did during their reign. And in times like this, when many events are global and of epic significance, it is simply criminal not to talk to each other. Therefore, we appreciate that the Trump administration from the very beginning offered to resume dialogue, and we have done so. We immediately noted back in February at the meeting with Marco Rubio, and then in telephone conversations between President Putin and Trump, that we recognize the presence of national interests in Russia, the United States, and all other countries. And the promotion of these national interests is the right of every state. And in those cases, and I am now meeting Marco Rubio again, and we discussed this philosophy with him. In those cases where the interests coincide, and in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, of course, there are not many such cases, but when they do coincide, coincide, it would be foolish not to use this circumstances to implement joint and mutually beneficial projects, be it in energy, in space, anywhere. And in those cases in which the majority, when the interests of Russia and the United States do not coincide, the main thing is not to allow this to turn into a clash, into a confrontation, especially a hot one. Here we have absolutely the same position. In diplomacy, as you know, and above all in public diplomacy, a lot can be said based on the moment. We have a lot of moments, and the specifics of each changes. Therefore, we do not see any departure of the United States from the course of an open, honest dialogue with Russia, as well as the People's Republic of China and a number of other countries with which the U.S. has disagreements and contradictions, as well as various views on how to continue trade, how to carry out economic affairs. Therefore, you see, this is exactly what diplomacy is all about. When the intersection of interests need to be reconciled and regulated in a way as to avoid confrontation. And when some of our European colleagues have turned diplomacy into the encirclement of their comrades from Washington, so that comrades from Washington continue to play Biden's war or replace diplomacy with sanctions, this is a very hopeless path that will not achieve any success. But honest dialogue on any issue, we see the readiness of the U.S. for this, and we are also ready for this. And diplomatic comments can be different from this reality. So next question. President Trump publicly asked President Erdogan to stop buying oil and gas from Russia. In the White House, do you expect Russia to stop these purchases, or do you think Ankara will continue to buy your raw materials? And Russia once has sold their S-400 air defense systems. You said last year that Turkey is a final user and cannot sell them to third countries. What can you say about this? I do not want to guess, but I want to confirm what I always say about Turkey and any other of our partners. We respect the position of the Turkish Republic, and we have no doubt that the Turkish Republic respects itself and its own people. That's a short answer. He skipped that one. Next month, Russia will chair the Security Council. What will be the focus of the mission? He says, every month on the agenda of the Security Council, there are questions that are a result of resolutions that have been adopted earlier. Resolutions, as a rule, imply a periodic review of how they're carried out, and the Secretariat simply distributes a list of topics that must be listened to, discussed. Oh. Now, how did that happen? Hold on a second. It started reading or playing the audio. I must have touched something incorrectly there. Where are we? Okay. Let's see here. There we go. I have found them. Couple of... I already read that one. Hold on. Darn it. That made me angry that it happened that way, because it played it kind of loud in my ear, and I didn't want to hear it. Let's see. Here we go. And the second, blah, blah, blah. In particular, our presidency, and he's talking about Russia's being the president of the Security Council, our presidency will consider implementation of Dayton Accords in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Remember, he talked about that, and I told you about that in my Kings. There's a king in Bosnia, And that is nonsensical. This needs to be, we're going to turn Bosnia, we're going to turn Moldova into war zones, we're going to turn Romania into war zones because of what we are doing. And maybe I shouldn't say we, maybe I should say because of what our foolish leaders are doing, both in the UN and in the U.S., because we're not doing anything to stop it. And then we allow Israel to do whatever the hell they want. This is nonsense. Well, we of course helped establish the king in Bosnia. That's nuts. Totally crazy. Anyway, his presidency, they want to talk about the Dayton Accords in Bosnia, which were the agreement signed to get rid of the Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then they sent a king over there. He's called the Supreme, what is he called? The High Representative or something like that. And he can veto anything. He's gotten rid of the president there. He outlawed him. He has can change judicial rulings. He can change any law. Doesn't have to have the authority of anyone. It's only him. You should go read it. And the U.S. is behind it with Europe. And they did a special thing to keep China and Russia out of it, because this person, if he was first, they gave him more powers. And then they appointed him, and he has to be approved by a Security Council, but they did it without the Security Council, and they put him in power anyway. And so Russia is really, they talked with the guy from Bosnia-Herzegovina about this last week, and I told you about that story last week sometime. You can go back and look at that. But it's BS. We're doing it again. And, the West is doing it again. He said, this will take some time because the situation there is critical. The Dayton Accords are being reviewed as a violation of the rights of the Serbian people, which they are, as well as a gross violation of the Dayton Accords, which they are, which declared the equality of the three states that make up Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnian people. This will be an interesting event, but the most important thing is that our presidency will have to attend a special meeting on October 24, the foundation day of the UN, and we plan to hold a special meeting this day. The purpose of the meeting is not to express our support for the principles laid down by the founders of the organization, but to see how these principles should be implemented today. Moreover, the vast majority of these principles directly relate to the processes of multipolarity. Do you remember way back when I was talking to you about BRICS, and I always talk about BRICS, and I've become a mini expert on BRICS, and always talk about the words being multipolarity. Well, it's not just BRICS. It's every other organization of a different type. And BRICS is just the fastest growing and the biggest. And they are creating these things, and it's always about multipolarity. And I said it the first time I first started talking about these a year and a half ago, or whenever, it was a little more than a year ago, that if they modified the UN somehow to allow everyone a fair shake in there and let it be ruled, as it were, by the U.S. and its cronies, then perhaps you have a chance to save it. But it's always the same. Always the same. The U.S. vetoes anything negative about Israel and ignores China and Russia and does things anyway when they see fit. And so rules for everybody else. And that is absolutely true. It's not just me saying this. This is all over the place. And people know it. It's not just, this is, if you don't know it, you should know it. And all the people involved, they definitely know it. They just choose to ignore it and hope that nothing will ever happen. But people are going to start bailing from the UN. It's a nonsense anyway. If you're not going to take care of everyone, it's nonsense. Anyway, he proceeds with his answer. These things include the sovereign equality of all states, non-interference in each other's affairs, the right of a nation to self-determination, and the right of people to determine their own fate. All of this was enshrined in the Dayton Accords, but it was not implemented. Therefore, this meeting will focus on the analysis and the preferably practical conclusions on how to further develop the United Nations. And then here's another one. Let's see. Krasnochayev speaks, blah, blah, blah. There's another one on Al-Quds al-Arabi, but I'm not interested in that either, and that's only peripheral. But he is talking again about the genocide in Gaza, and he based it on facts, and he expressed a strong position of Russian Federation, but could talk about the speech. He wants Lavrov to talk about that speech. And the second, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on May 20 issued an arrest warrant for 2 Israeli war criminals. And to this day, these crimes continue. The genocide continues, and there are no accusations against other Israeli war criminals, ministers, and so on. And that one, I've said enough about it, but, well, maybe not. But I'm not going to speak about that tonight. I want to focus on the things that I like to talk about. And he, like I said, he had a very long press conference, and I want to make sure we can get through it as well. He wanted to ask 2 questions. This next one. Can Vladimir Zelensky count on the return of borders of 2022? And how is the situation in DPR today? Donetsk People's Republic is what that means. As for the border of 2022, says Lavrov, no one is counting on them. It would be political blindness to count on the return of the borders. Russia defends its legal interest. The legal interest of the people whose children were threatened to rot in basements until the children of the Ukrainian elite could drive beautiful cars, go to schools. We should forget about it. All these talks about the return of borders of some years have been going on for a long time. All these talks are connected with the fact that Ukrainian leaders who came to power in February 2014 illegally constantly lied and broke all of their agreements. If the agreement between the president and the opposition, which was guaranteed by Germany, France, Poland, and Ukraine, would be in the borders of 1991, then there would, well, he's saying the borders would not have moved. There would not even have been any events if they had followed these agreements. He's talking about the Minsk Accords, which everybody agreed to and then said it was only to give Ukraine time to rearm. He goes, then they would not rebel in Crimea. They would not refuse to recognize the illegal power of Kiev. After that, the war began. Those who did not recognize the illegal power, the Kiev regime began to bomb and then burn houses. This happened immediately after 2014. People who said no to rule or to some of the things that, or chose not to recognize this illegal regime, they were targeted and bombed. So those who did not recognize this power, the Kiev regime began to bomb and burn their houses. And that's true. Began to kill them. In Odessa, 50 people were burned alive. He's talking about the Union Trade House burnings where pro-Russian protesters were burned alive in a building. Blocked the doors. These guys blocked the doors and burned them alive. Lugansk was bombed by planes over and over. All territories were shelled with artillery. It is strictly forbidden to use the army in an internal conflict. It's a violation of international humanitarian law. That'd be like the U.S. saying the army's going to, go after I don't know, Mexicans. Pick them, pick one. But that's what they did in Ukraine. They used the army to go after Russian-speaking people. A year later, there were Minsk agreements which were guaranteed by Germany and France. If they were fulfilled by the top of the Kiev regime, Ukraine would be at the borders of 1991, except for Crimea. There was a referendum in Crimea. In 2014, John Kerry told me that Crimea should be forgotten. Let's talk about Donbass. Donbass was forgotten. Ukraine was also forgotten. If the agreements were fulfilled in April, Ukraine would be at the borders of 1991, except for Crimea and Donbass. But Ukraine was forgotten, and it refused to fulfill its own initiative. Therefore, we are not talking about the borders of 1991. We are talking about the borders of the Russian Constitution. And what is your second question? He said, what do you think about the situation in DPR? He said, I will not comment on the situation on the battlefield. You can listen to them from the Defense Ministry. And he said, this one was a funny one. He said, it was a U.S. reporter, I forget where from, but he said, I would like you to answer this question in English, please. Trump called Russia a paper tiger. He said the European countries should shoot down Russian planes if they hit the airspace of Europe. Do you think this is a provocation? And Lavrov said, in Russian, he said, Russian is the official language here as well as English. Therefore, I am grateful to all of you for your respect of our rights to use our own language. I remember that a day after the term paper tiger was used, President Trump was asked if he still considered Russia a paper tiger, and he said no. I have already answered the question of what I think about President Trump's statements. In public diplomacy, various methods and techniques are used. Same applies to statements that Trump allowed to bomb the Russian Federation, shoot down Russian planes and drones. When a drone flies not over our territory, if it crosses someone else's borders and leaves our airspace, everyone has the right to do what they think is necessary to ensure their own safety. However, if there is an attempt to shoot down a flying object or any object in our territory, in our airspace, I think people will be very sorry if they violate our territorial integrity. And this lady, first, the German authorities do not hide the fact that they are actively militarizing their country. What do you think is the reason for this? And what are they going to achieve? Secondly, you have repeatedly mentioned privatization of the UN by the West. What can Russia do to change this situation? He said, regarding militarization of Germany, we repeatedly have expressed, this is important, our deep concern. Not only is there a process of militarization, but there are obvious signs of renazification. Why is this being done? I think it is done with the same aim as Hitler's, to subjugate the whole of Europe and to attempt a strategic defeat. In the case of Hitler and the Soviet Union, and in the case of modern Germany, and in the case of other major soloists of the EU and NATO, namely the Russian Federation. I think Merz said yesterday that we are not yet in a state of war, but that we are no longer in a state of peace. Militaristic rhetoric is growing every day. His famous phrase, which he has used more than once, is that he has broken through the amendments to the Constitution, and now he can spend more money on arms, on military infrastructure, and military potential. And his goal is to make Germany the main military machine of Europe again. When a person in a country that has committed crimes such as Nazism, fascism, the Holocaust, and genocide says that Germany needs to be a subjugator again to become a great military power, he has an atrophy of historic memory. And this is very, very dangerous. He's talking about Merz. And Mertz really did say these things, by the way. And he said, the second, look, I was honest about the second question. Let's see, what was the second question? Oh, privatization of the UN. That the West is privatizing. He said, I've been honest about this, and we do not hide it. Many positions at the level of Deputy Secretary General seem to be scattered across different continents, but there are several positions that directly affect the functioning of the UN Secretary and the decisions of the UN Secretary makes to approve member states. You see, when the Secretary recommends something, the member states generally have a great temptation to support it. We have a Secretary General, a citizen of one country, a NATO member, a director of the Department of Political Affairs and Peacebuilding, a citizen of the country, a NATO member, a director of the Department of Peacekeeping, a citizen of the country, a NATO member, a director of the Humanitarian Department, a citizen of the country, a NATO member, a director of the Department of Security, which is also important for the organization of work of the entire UN system. A citizen of the country, another person. I mentioned that the British head of the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, now Mr. Guterres, has issued an initiative for UN 80, which contains a few radical proposals that require deep study and analysis, and in which all members need to participate. And so he wants to go further on this. I'm not going to go too far into this. That one doesn't really matter to us. But let's see. Here's another question. I represent India, and I have a question. India continues to buy Russian oil, despite the fact that the United States insists that this importation should be reduced. How do you see the relationship with India in this context, and what does this fact mean for the relationship between India and Russia? He said, I cannot consider this kind of situation between India and the United States or between India and any other country as a criterion for the relationship between India and Russia. We have long had a strategic partnership. At some stage, our Indian friends proposed to add to the term, and the relationship began to be called a privileged strategic partnership. A little later, our Indian friends again proposed another clarification, and now this relationship is called a particularly privileged strategic partnership. We fully respect the national interests of India and foreign policy used by Modi to promote his own national interests. We have regular high-level contacts. Just recently, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin met in Tianjin at the Show's summit. In December, we are preparing a state visit of President Putin to New Delhi. We have huge and rich bilateral agenda of trade, economy, finance, military, technical cooperation, humanitarian context, healthcare, high-tech, artificial intelligence, and of course, close coordination in the international arena of part of SHOS, BRICS, and bilateral channels. This year, my colleague, Mr. Jaishankar, will visit Russia, and I will visit India. There will be regular exchanges. I do not even ask our Indian colleagues what will happen to our trade, our oil. They solve everything perfectly on their own. And publicly, my comrade Jaishankar said, answering a similar questions, that if the U.S. wants to sell us their oil, we are ready to discuss the terms. But what we buy from other countries is our own business, and they do not belong to the India-American agenda. I think this is a very worthy answer from Mr. Jaishankar and shows that India represents itself well, and as does Turkey, which was the prior question that he talked about. Here's one from RT, Russia Today, the English-speaking version. He said, my name is Igor Zhdanov from RT. Hello, Sergei Viktorovich. Recently, there have been more and more conversations about difficulties that delegations come to the UN General Assembly face. The Russian delegation has more than once dealt with the problem of obtaining visas. This year, the leader of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, could not personally visit the UN General Assembly. How do you assess the legitimacy of such actions by the United States, given that the headquarters is in New York? And how could you comment on the increasingly frequent calls to move this headquarters to another country? And he says, yes, this is a serious inconvenience. I do not want to say that the countries whose delegations face problems are suffering, but this is a serious violation of the agreement between the UN headquarters and host countries. The host country is obliged to issue visas to all UN events on time at the request of the host country, on the eve of a particular session, whether it is the General Assembly or other UN bodies. We regularly miscalculate the number of participants of our delegation, including those from the State Duma, when President includes members of the delegation and parliamentarians, and not everyone is always given a visa. I mentioned this to Marco Rubio at our meeting in Manhattan on Wednesday. Another member of our ministry, the director of a department, was not given a visa. This is not the only violation of the agreement between the UN headquarters and the host country. The most serious violation is the arrest of our diplomatic property during the Obama administration. He did this a couple of weeks before the inauguration of Donald Trump in his first term. It is very disrespectful when you want to seize the property of someone who, in accordance with the law, the Constitution, and the will of the people, will be replaced in the White House. He left us a legacy, and we still cannot destroy it. However, our dialogue on visas, on functioning embassies, on this property that was seized, and on other aspects of daily functioning of diplomatic institution has been going on for at least 2 rounds. Marco Rubio and I have agreed to hold another meeting this autumn. Isn't that crazy that, he's still fighting to get property that was seized by the Obama administration and nobody will give it back? Nonsense. As for the relocation of UN to another country, he says many people, including recently the presidents of Ecuador, president of Colombia, when he was not given a visa to get here, he is a simple and straightforward person. Many people suggested that I start thinking about it, but I think that these proposals are exclusively polemical in order to make the topic of the UN Committee on Relocation a little more pressing. There is a legend that during the first talks on the creation of an international organization between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, Joseph Vissarionovich, that's Stalin, actively called the UN headquarters in Sochi. However, Sochi proved that it could not accept a large-scale event, and the Olympic infrastructure would be ready if such decisions were to be made. Therefore, it could be comfortable for all the Secretariat employees to do sports there. That's funny. Thank you, Mr. Minister. President Trump threatens sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil. Do you have any concrete steps that you propose to India in order to save the economic partnership between Russia and India? And secondly, did you discuss India with Mr. Rubio? He said, there is no answer, or I will not answer, the second question. We are not used to discussing our friends in context with third countries. As for the oil issue, I've already answered that question. The question of your colleague, who is also a representative of the Indian mass media. However, you asked whether there's a possibility to save the economic partnership between Russia and India, and I have no doubt that that relationship is not threatened. The Indian Prime Minister and Indian Foreign Minister have explained that India chooses its own partners. If the United States has a proposal to enrich bilateral trade between Russia and India, they are ready to discuss the conditions that the Americans propose. However, India is ready to discuss trade, investment, economic, military, and technical relations, between India and third countries only with those it concerns. That's very diplomatic. I like that. Let's see. Here's another one. There is information that Kiev is preparing another provocation on the territory of the European Union to attack NATO, Romania, and Poland under false flag operations and accuse Russia. What would be the consequences? Will any work be taken in advance? And Lavrov says, this is not the first time that such things have happened. I have no doubt all these reports have a reliable basis. The Kiev regime has special structures in media, military, and technical spheres engaged in provocations even now under a false flag. I have read that they are now equipping our drones so that there is no doubt that we launched them. In addition to the hysterics in Poland, Estonia, the Baltic states, and other countries, there are serious people in serious capitals who understand everything perfectly. In those serious capitals, the elites are committed to suppressing Russia. They do not talk about strategic defeat, but the goal of strategic defeat is always in their heads. That's true. They will modify how this defeat should look, but this is what they say. I know for a fact that the British helped the Ukrainians in all of this filth, as they have done for centuries in our geopolitical space. We are well aware of this. We have military intelligence and foreign intelligence that periodically show the true face of those who try to instigate such provocations. I do not think it very likely that we will get an answer to this question, but the answer to such things, especially if they begin to take physical steps, they will regret it very much. Our president has repeatedly said that we will not allow any violation of our territory or our airspace by those in Europe who are openly preparing for war against us. Then there was another question in Iran, but I'm not going to talk about. Let's see. They did have Iraqi Kurds, though, and I find that interesting. Minister Lavrov, thank you for coming and having a long conversation with journalists. I'm from the Iraqi Kurdistan media. We see how a wave of recognition of Palestine's rights to self-determination is spreading. Of course, the Palestinians deserve to have their own country. The Iraqi Kurds held a referendum, as you may remember, and no country recognized the results. The international community almost unanimously opposed the will of the people. Why is the will of the people ignored then? Is there a double standard? And my second question is about an oil deal. He said, two questions closely related to each other. The fact that the oil deal between Baghdad and Erbil has been reached only means one thing. Kurds and Arabs in Iraq can reach an agreement. We are very happy about this. I've spoken to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Iraq. We communicate regularly with the leadership of the Kurdish Autonomous Region. We do not wish Kurdish problem to explode because not all Kurdish structures have peaceful plans and wishes. Considering the large number of Kurds living in a number of countries of this region, there are people who want to blow up the Kurdish problem. I think that the Middle East will not be able to withstand another large-scale explosion. Therefore, in order to appease everyone, an agreement has to be reached. But without establishing a dialogue, without reaching a national agreement in the country or regions, including those countries where there are Kurds, whether that be in Iraq, Syria, or Iran, the countries will simply fall apart. Probably someone will say that this is the right of the nation to self-determination. But if you do not have a war, you cannot reach agreement in these conditions. Erbil and Baghdad have proven this, and we support that. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Did the topic come up with Marco Rubio on the strategic nuclear forces treaties? Did you see any reaction from the international community, the initiative here at the Polish General Assembly? He said, thank you. This initiative came up just a day before the opening of the General Assembly. I confirmed it again in my speech at the plenary session. We are distributing the full text of Putin's statement by September 22 as a document to the Security Council. I am sure that when the fuss of this high-level week is over, when everyone is busy with their high delegation in the capitals, there will be assessments. The official representative of the White House said that this is a very interesting statement and that Trump will definitely comment on it personally. He said, only 2 more questions. Says, according to the Wall Street Journal, here's the next question, Donald Trump told Vladimir Zelensky that he was ready to lift the restrictions on the use of American weapons for strikes on Russia. Did Marco Rubio warn you about this during talks? What will be the answer if this is the case? Do you think it is possible? And Lavrov says, I don't like to guess. You quoted the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times wrote that Zelensky asked him to give him tomahawks, but Trump did not give him tomahawks. Therefore, it would be ungrateful to react to every line of the New York Times. We are coming from the fact that all of our experience of communication with our American colleagues, including at the very highest levels, says that they want to put an end to this and help end the conflict based on the account and liquidation of its primary causes. There are no other countries in the Western camp that are taking such positions. And I have no doubt that the U.S. president is interested in this as well. The other thing is that these Europeans are trying to influence him. Zelensky has now begun to boast that President Trump understands him better than he understands President Putin. You know, there are a lot of people who want to shine on the international stage, so I do not react to every line or proposal. One last question. And Maria Zakharova says, here's a woman in a beautiful pink blouse. Please. Her name's Raisa Garcia from Television Telesur. She says, 2 questions. You said the Ukraine does not want to negotiate with Russia. In this context, do you think it is a way to end the conflict? And second, how does Russia interpret U.S. military threats in the Caribbean against Venezuela? And what are the risks to regional and global security? He said, as for the second question about Venezuela, it is now much more relevant. We are, of course, very concerned that Americans have now organized in international waters, but around the territorial waters of Venezuela. I spoke today and yesterday with Foreign Minister Ivan Hill and many other representatives of the Latin American region and the Caribbean, and they are quite concerned. Brazilian and island states such as St. Vincent, Grenada, today met in Nizhny Novgorod with Nicaragua. The situation is really serious because there are significant armed forces there, including nuclear submarines. And against this background, there are threats of direct military intervention to destroy a drug cartel, wage war on drug trafficking as a whole. I was even told one thing today that did not occur to me. On the same day at the Security Council, our American colleagues, together with Panama, are promoting a resolution to transform the international security forces in Haiti into international forces to combat banditry. He means piracy. And in a very specific mandate is being requested. Then they want the Security Council to approve the creation of such forces, leaving their formation at the discretion of those who are interested. And the mandate will be to apply force in a limited number, in an unlimited number, in unlimited quantity against gangs. Against these gangs, it will be possible to apply force. No terms of this operation are provided. No reporting system is provided to the Security Council. If we compare these processes, the Security Council process is what is happening around Venezuela now. I do not rule out that some creative figure will come up with a mandate from the Security Council and then say that the bandits from Haiti are hiding in Venezuela. I don't rule this out at all. He doesn't believe anything either. Therefore, we are, of course, in solidarity with the people and the government of Venezuela. They have every right to determine their own political and economic course and social path. And we believe that interfering in international affairs of other countries is unacceptable. So do I, by the way. I think what we're doing down there is just plain old wrong. Once again, this is against a requirement of the UN Charter. As for negotiations, your first question about the negotiations with Ukraine, I asked employees, they have prepared me large material on how the position of Kiev has evolved regarding negotiations. On April 17, 2022, immediately after the Ukrainians broke the agreement they themselves proposed when the British prohibited them from agreement. Immediately after that, Zelensky says, we can fight Russia for 10 years. Our society does not want to continue negotiations. Quote, on October 1, the same year, Zelensky suddenly says, Ukraine is ready for negotiation with Russia, but already with another president, not with Putin. In March 2023, his former foreign minister, Kuleba, when the illegal International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the president of Russia, Kuleba says, we knew long before that it was pointless. Our National Security Council of Ukraine made a decision in which it stated that a negotiation with Putin are impossible. These are the same people who a year later began to say that Putin was running away from them. On May 4, 2023, Zelensky says that for us, the result is exclusive specific sentences to all Russian military criminals, including the highest leadership of the aggressor country. And his advisor in May 2023 is such a scoundrel. He said, quote, Ukraine hates you. We will pursue you always and everywhere. There is nothing to talk about with you. You do not understand human language. Ukraine will get each of you, and it does not matter how exactly, legally, or physically. These guys are now saying that it means we do not wish to talk with them. And Zelensky last year said Russia can start negotiation with us only if they leave our territory. This again, returning to the topic of the 1991 borders and so on. They have been tormenting us for a long time by truce with no condition. And 1 year ago, Zelensky and Macron negotiated with themselves and then said that today in the media there was a lot of information about talking about ceasefire. Ukraine does not consider the possibility of ceasefire in exchange for guarantees of Western countries. So this is not a topic for discussion. No truce. Now they say that immediate truce and guarantees of Western countries are necessary. And then, even with guarantees, he still doesn't want a truce. Therefore, you may judge for yourselves what these people are who are led by such a character like Zelensky. Thank you very much. Do you think we really need a truce? Do you want me to stay? And, so he was given one more question after that. So we'll get into that one too. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question on gender balance. He said, thank you very much. In Polyachoven, you had a meeting in the Russian Confederation format. How effective and timely is such a format? And if you allow me a second question, France suspended the cooperation with Mali in the fight against terrorism. against a background of diplomatic crises. French media publish materials and sympathize with terrorists and separatists. In your opinion, what's the connection with the policy of Paris and the revenge of the sovereign choice of Barnacle, or the answer of rapprochement with Russia? He said, you yourself answered the second question. Of course it is so. Moreover, there are Ukrainian specialists who provide drones to various combat forces and train them in that country. This information is confirmed. As for the meeting of the ministers in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, it took place a second time. We met in Moscow. We will continue the practice, including in this region. We discussed all the plans we have for meetings at the highest level for recent trips to these countries and our delegations, headed by the Deputy Prime Minister, with the participation of representatives of the Ministry of Energy, and other structures of the economic bloc. We have a good plan for joint projects in the field of natural resources, energy, nuclear power, humanitarian cooperation, and military technical cooperation. These countries need help. We discussed the need to build bridges between them and ECOWAS, which is another African agency. They are neighbors and need to exist together. In our context with ECOWAS and the African Union, we stressed the need to provide full participation to this trio of countries in the work of the African Union and the relevant regional integrity structure. Thank you very much. Now, I realized that what I have done tonight is a little unorthodox, to get you the English translation, but nobody talks about it over here. You never get to hear any of this. And you'll hear all kinds of stuff about what Trump said and what all of these others said. Nobody, especially on the issue of Ukraine, but you don't ask the other side. Nobody talks to the other side. Nobody says anything about what Russia puts out at that time. And I think that something needs to change in that regard, and it needed to change long, long ago, and it just never has. And so I chose this time to change it, to make it different, to do something a little different on this end, and see what we could do about that of a lack of information that we have out there. And so I hope you appreciated that and got to hear it all. And I thank you very much for listening to the program. Now, I'm going to share with you, see if there's anything new. If there's anything new on the Moldova thing, if there has been any more info. Nope, they say there's nothing there. Here's one. Let's see. We have an accusation. Yuri Vitnyansky, a member of the Revival Party, formerly part of the banned Victory Bloc, accused President Sandu's government of violating constitutional rights of hundreds of thousands of Moldovan citizens. We witness how, with 301 polling stations open abroad, there was massive segregation, discrimination of our compatriots who live in Russia, where only 2 stations were open. This is a blatant violation of constitutional rights. Well, it's hard to disagree with that. Did you hear about the very sad news that occurred in India? I know who this is. His name is, it was a political rally. There's a guy named VJ over there, and he's a very important and famous actor, and very, very famous all over the place in India. And he has turned into a politician. and 39 people died. This is a last count, and 50 were injured in a stampede at the political rally that was held in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. People are dying on the ground. They're squished. The incident happened, let's see. They ordered a judicial probe so far. 39 people died, 13 men, 17 women, 4 boys, and 5 girls, while 51 people, 26 men and 25 women, are receiving intensive treatment. Videos of the event, and it's not pretty, show thousands of people surrounding his campaign vehicle with VJ standing on top addressing the crowd. He was throwing water bottles because the emergency rooms were full. Following the incident, the 51-year-old actor turned politician expressed his grief. He said, "I'm at a loss for words to express the pain in my heart. My eyes and mind are clouded with sorrow. The faces of all of you whom I have met kept flashing through my mind," he said on X. One of India's top stars launched the TVK party in 2024, draws massive crowds at his appearances. For 3 decades, he has been one of the most bankable characters in cinema, with a devoted fan following that translates into large political rallies. He's now preparing for state elections in early 2026, with his party seen as challenging the ruling Davida DMK party and Indian Prime Minister Modi's Bharatiya Janata party. The state government criticized the actor for violating guidelines at his rally, which is what led to the tragedy, according to them. The outlet cited official sources claiming that the organizers failed to provide arrangements for drinking water and food, and people were fainting in the crowd. That's a horrible story. Sorry to hear it. But on we go. This is Damn Radio. This is International Flavor. You can find me here Sunday through Thursday from 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m., except on Sunday when I go to 11. And I'm glad you're here. You can always catch my shows at internationalflavor.com, where all of my shows get uploaded. And you can also get them at damnradio.com/podcasts. I very much appreciate you listening to the show. Have a good night.